There is a moment in certain relationships that does not look dramatic from the outside, but inside, it changes everything. It is the moment when a person who has spent years feeling everything too deeply suddenly begins to understand what they have been feeling all along. Not just sadness, not just confusion, not just the familiar ache of trying harder and somehow receiving less. They begin to recognize the structure underneath it, the pattern, the manipulation, the way their empathy was never simply appreciated, but studied, leaned on, and quietly used against them. And once that happens, the relationship is never the same again. Because people talk about empaths as if they are only soft, only giving, only vulnerable. But that is not the full picture. A deeply empathic person is not just emotionally open. They are perceptive. They notice tonal shifts, inconsistencies, hidden tension, the tiny crack between what someone says and what they mean. The problem is not that they cannot see. It is that for too long, they explain away what they see. They override it with compassion. They replace instinct with patience. They keep telling themselves there must be a kinder interpretation. That is where the narcissistic person gets comfortable. They sense the openness. They sense the tolerance. They sense the reflex to understand before judging, to repair before leaving, to look inward before naming what is happening outwardly. And in the beginning, that dynamic can look almost magnetic. The empath feels seen. The narcissist feels fed. One offers depth. The other offers intensity. And for a while, intensity pretends to be connection, but it never stays there. Eventually, the empath begins to notice that the relationship runs on distortion. They start seeing how every conversation bends toward the narcissist's needs, wounds, moods, interpretations, timing. They begin noticing how apologies arrive without change, how blame shifts without warning, how tenderness is used to pull them close, and coldness is used to keep them off balance. They see that what looked like intimacy was often just access to their attention, their loyalty, their emotional labor, their ability to absorb damage and still keep loving. And when that realization lands, it does not make them louder first. It makes them still. That stillness is where the danger begins for the narcissist, because the version of the empath they know how to control is the one who keeps explaining, the one who keeps asking, "Did I misunderstand?" The one who keeps giving one more chance because their own heart is too decent to believe someone could be that calculated, that empty, that committed to control. But once the empath stops arguing inside the narcissist's version of reality, something changes in the room. The narcissist feels it before they can even name it. Their words do not land the same. Their guilt trips do not move the body the same way. The old hooks come back empty. This is why awareness matters so much. Not because it makes the empath hard, because it makes them accurate. And accuracy is a problem for people who survive by keeping others confused. Once the empath sees the pattern, they stop treating every incident like an isolated misunderstanding. They stop giving each new betrayal a brand new excuse. They stop acting as if today's cruelty can be separated from yesterday's gaslighting and last month's manipulation. They begin connecting the dots, and the moment the dots connect, the narcissist loses one of their greatest advantages, the empath's self-doubt. That is when boundaries start to change too. Not theatrical boundaries, not the kind announced in long emotional speeches that only give the narcissist more material to twist. Real boundaries are often much quieter than that. A shorter reply, a delayed response, a refusal to explain what has already been explained 10 times. A conversation ended the moment it turns disrespectful. A visit declined. A number blocked. A pattern no longer entertained, simply because it arrived in a familiar voice. To the narcissist, that shift feels like betrayal, not because the empath has become cruel, but because access is being interrupted. And narcissistic people often mistake access for entitlement. They believe they should still be able to reach inside you, stir the old feelings, restart the old dance, and watch you fall back into position. So when the empath begins to say no without trembling, or withdraw without chasing, or remain calm where they once collapsed, the narcissist does not experience that as growth. They experience it as loss of control. That is why they escalate. People often think, if I stay calm, maybe things will settle down. But very often the opposite happens first. The more unavailable the empath becomes to the old pattern, the more the narcissist pushes to recover it. More bait, more accusations, more fake vulnerability, more rewriting of history, more sudden emergencies, more attempts to force a reaction because a reaction is proof that the tether still exists. But something profound happens when the empath no longer reacts the way they used to. The dynamic begins to expose itself. What used to feel like a relationship starts looking more like a system built on provocation, pursuit, confusion, repair, depletion, and repetition. And once the empath sees that system clearly, they stop feeding it with the same innocence. They begin to observe instead of absorb. That shift is enormous. When a person who used to internalize everything begins to witness everything, the spell weakens. This is the part some people describe as the empath becoming the narcissist's mirror. But the mirror is not revenge. It is clarity. The empath is no longer scrambling to soften the truth. They are no longer cushioning every observation to make it easier for the narcissist to hear. They are no longer running behind the other person, cleaning up emotional debris and calling it love. Instead, they become calm enough to let behavior reveal itself. A lie is allowed to sound like a lie. A manipulation is allowed to sit there unrescued. A cruel remark is met with distance instead of a desperate attempt to restore warmth. That kind of reflection is unbearable to someone who depends on distortion, because the narcissist can survive your pain. They can survive your anger. In some twisted way, they even know how to use it. But what they cannot manage well is your emotional sobriety, your clean perception, your refusal to keep participating in the fantasy that this is all happening by accident. The moment the empath stops helping the narcissist maintain that illusion, the narcissist starts meeting consequences they have spent years avoiding. Not punishment, consequences. The consequence of being clearly seen. And then comes indifference, which is where the real collapse often begins. Not fake indifference, not performative coldness designed to make someone jealous. Real indifference is different. It arrives when the empath is no longer obsessed with being understood by the very person who kept profiting from misunderstanding them. It arrives when they stop needing closure from someone who lives by keeping things unresolved. It arrives when they realize that healing does not require one last conversation, one last confession, one last apology that finally sounds sincere. That kind of emotional detachment is devastating to a narcissistic person because it removes them from the center of the empath's internal world, and that is where narcissists are most comfortable living. As long as they are in your head, they still feel powerful. As long as you are replaying, deciphering, hoping, hurting, defending, wondering, they still occupy psychic space. But once the empath reclaims that space, once their attention turns inward and then outward toward a life that is no longer organized around the narcissist's behavior, the entire structure begins to starve. That is why self-devotion becomes such a threat. When the empath begins pouring care back into themselves, the shift is not cosmetic. It is structural. They rest differently, choose differently, speak differently. They stop giving endless access to people who treat tenderness like a resource to extract. They stop confusing compassion with obligation. They stop offering loyalty where there is no safety. And with each one of those changes, the narcissist becomes less and less relevant, not because the empath is trying to punish them, but because the empath is finally becoming the center of their own life. That is the part narcissists hate most. Not that you are angry, not that you exposed them, not even that you left. It is that you no longer revolve. And from there, walking away becomes possible in a way it never was before. Not because the empath suddenly feels nothing, but because they finally understand enough. They understand that some people do not use connection to build closeness. They use it to build control. They understand that endless explaining is not intimacy, that chaos is not passion, that being read deeply by someone is not the same thing as being loved well by them. They understand that the bond felt profound, partly because it kept touching the deepest parts of them. But being deeply affected by something does not make it good for you. So when they leave, it is not always loud. Sometimes it is the quietest thing in the world. A text not answered. A door no longer opened. A cycle not resumed. A life slowly rearranged around peace instead of recovery from chaos. And that quiet is what lands hardest, because a narcissist is not most disturbed by your fury. Fury still proves they can move you. What unsettles them most is the moment the empath becomes emotionally unavailable to the old pattern. When the person who once poured, forgave, explained, and endured begins standing in a different kind of power, one built from discernment, boundaries, and self-respect, the narcissist runs out of ways to feel central. That is when the game ends. Not because the empath learned how to destroy, because they finally learned how to stop feeding what was destroying them.